A very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the ISAS book discussion today, titled India's First Dictatorship. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate it if you could mute your videos and mute your microphones throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback, please forward them via the Zoom chat to the moderator. The questions will be consolidated for the panelists to answer. This afternoon, we are delighted to have with us the authors of the book. First, Dr. Christophe Jaffrelot, Research Director at SIRI Sciences Po, CNRS, and Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at the King's India Institute, London. And second, Mr. Pratinav Anil, PhD candidate at St. John's College, University of Oxford. Joining them today as a discussant will be Dr. Diego Maiorano, Research Fellow at ISAS. Chairing the session will be Dr. Ronojoy Sen, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead in Politics, Society and Governance at ISAS. I now invite Dr. Ronojoy to take over the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I won't take up much of your time since you're here to listen to the authors and the incisive questions that will be posed to them by Diego. I've also just finished a 2-hour class on Gandhi, not India, but MK. So my voice is also not in the best of shape. But before I hand the floor over to Diego, a few quick points. One, there have been very few analytical books on the emergency, with a majority of them having been journalistic or first-person accounts. This has been addressed to some extent by recent books like Gyan Prakash's Emergency Chronicles. So India's first dictatorship then fills a critical gap in scholarship. This book, as the authors point out, benefited from the transcripts of the Shah Commission held between 1977 to 78, which were part of the American scholar Granville Austin's papers. Finally, in addition to the detailed and very meticulous analysis of the emergency and what it represents, the authors make a very provocative point about the uniqueness of the emergency in the story of Indian democracy. They ask the crucial question on how exceptional the emergency was for the average Indian. And their conclusion, and here I'm quoting them, they say, comparing the emergency to the quarter century of democracy that preceded it and to the decades following it, especially when seen from certain regions such as India's peripheries and from the eyes of certain classes, namely the country's working poor in particular, not very much. Thus, their conclusion is that the emergency was not an aberration of the kind that had usually been made out to be. On that note, I hand the floor over to Diego. Diego.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Just a word of thanks to Christophe and Pratinav for writing a very engaging book, a long book, but a very easy, pleasant read that is full of details and full of anecdotes and is based on a wealth of sources that is truly, truly remarkable. And I would like to start my questions to the authors from where Ronojoy left, which is the end of the book, the conclusion, which, to quote again from the book, the emergency was, in essence, more of the same, for the poor especially. And this goes against two widely held views of the emergency, one that was just a parenthesis in the story of India's democracy, and the other one that was a turning point, after which everything has somewhat changed. So my first question to you would be, in what sense and in what ways was those 21 months of authoritarianism were in continuity with what preceded it and what followed it?
Thank you, Diego and Ronojoy. We will divide the time equally with Pratinav, so I'll try to be as quick as I can, and I will elaborate on my first responses. Well, first of all, there is certainly a trend in the 60s and early 70s that creates a sense of continuity between the pre-period, the pre-emergency period, and the emergency itself. It's in a way, it's the culminating point of a process of personalization and centralization of power, going back to the, if you want, replacement of the old guard congressman by new sycophants of Mrs. Gandhi. This is the transition from Nehru's Gandhi to Indira Gandhi's Congress, if you want, Nehru's Congress to Indira Gandhi's Congress. So it's not, in that sense, a turning point, and certainly not an aberration. And we may return to that, but it could not be an aberration for the simple reason that the support that came from so many different well-established quarters of Indian society showed that it was something some people were waiting for. A turning point to some extent, and we are very particular about what has been introduced by the emergency and remained afterwards. I will just list three clear changes. This is a moment of accentuation of criminalization of politics in India, and that has not been reverted. And many of the villains of the 75, 77 years remained influential in politics, and some of them even stoked the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in Delhi. New people were promoted by Sanjay Gandhi and remained influential in politics. That's a turning point. The other turning point that we emphasize is that this is the moment when RSS, Sangh Parivar, people at large are mainstreamized. And we may return to this because that's a turning point that matters even today. And thirdly, it's also a turning point. It's also a watershed moment for industrial relations, because the neoliberal, or at least the liberalization turn that India will accentuate in the 80s is taken at that time. And I would add, it's not necessarily market friendly, it's probably more business friendly. And this is a turning point in terms of the rise of crony capitalism as well. So we do not deny that some of the new developments that India experienced subsequently took shape, crystallized at the time of the emergency. But we argue that for many other people, or at least for many people, it was more of the same. And just two quick illustrations for that. You know, the emergency is better known for mass sterilization, for displacement of slum dwellers. And when you look at the data that we have collected, you realize that, well, that's not something new. And it's not something that will go afterwards. If you look at the figures we have compiled, you see that there were 2.6 million people who were sterilized during the first year of the emergency, but there were 3.1 million of people who were sterilized in 72, 73. You had more people sterilized before emergency than during the first year of emergency. So for those who were at the bottom of the pyramid and who were the first people affected by this policy, by the way, a World Bank supported policy, and we may return to the international support that the emergency received. The change is certainly not in nature. It may be, of course, of degree, because that intensified. But subsequently in 76 and 70, well, 77, only the first month. And secondly, we also look at the emergency at a time when beautification of cities became the order of the day, with a new urban planning agenda, anti-encroachment drives, especially in Delhi. Well, there's nothing new there either. Of course, Chokman Gate is a very acute moment of even drama, but to drive out people from the center of Delhi and to resettle them at the periphery was already something that Jagmohan orchestrated. And interestingly, Jagmohan, the right-hand man of Sanjay Gandhi in Delhi, was very well in place before the emergency. And he will remain very influential after the emergency, becoming even the Lieutenant Governor of Jammu and Kashmir. So where is the turning point there? For those who have been displaced before, and for those who will be displaced after, it's really more of the same. Of course, it's more intense. And Jagmohan, during the Shah Commission hearings, will say, well, I could do more quickly, but my plans were already there before. So we really emphasize that in the conclusion that when you look at the poor, those who were at the receiving end of state policies for a long time before, and who will continue to be at the receiving end of state policies after, it was more of the same. And we drew our inspiration there from a book that is probably one of the best books on the emergency by Emma Charlo, that has interviewed the people who have been displaced and who said, well, nothing much has changed really after the emergency so far as the slum dwellers were concerned. So that's why we emphasize the continuity. And of course, last but not least, that's my last sentence, we have looked at the emergency not only in the places where it was implemented the most forcefully, but across the country. And in many states, peasants were hardly affected. You know, the Mofussil people in Karnataka, Maharashtra, South India at large, East India as well, were hardly aware that there was something called the emergency, at least till mid-76. The epicenter of the atrocities were, of course, Delhi, Haryana, West UP, but the further you went from that epicenter to the periphery, the less affected people were. And they were affected by the same things they were affected forever. That is local oppression, caste segregation, and so on and so forth.
Well, Christophe, you're quite right in emphasizing that the sterilization program, the gentrification program, and even when it came to industrial relations, there's a lot in common with the emergency and the periods that both preceded it and succeeded it. And I could give 3 more examples where we see that the worst of authoritarianism wasn't on display during the emergency, but also on the democratic periods that bookended it. So one could look at arbitrary incarceration, for example. So some 110,000 people were thrown behind bars between 1975 and 77. But it is important to remember that there's a long history of punishment in the Indian setting. So certainly while for many in Delhi and India's metropolises, the harsh realities of the Indian carceral state came home only during the emergency, but for many other Indians, and I'm thinking of the Naxalites, the Misos, the Nagas, those in the borderlands more generally, inner city Muslims, those living in India's tribal belts, there was nothing new about the emergency. It was not in any sense a break from the past, and nor was what transpired after the regime very different for them. So the securitization of these regions in the main hinterlands and borderlands continues to this day. And one could also look at paramilitary and police violence, press censorship. Again, these have a very long history. So in 1958, for example, Nehru passed the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which allowed the military to adopt a shoot-to-kill policy to deal with northeastern rebels. And India's very first amendment in 1950 imposed considerable restrictions on free speech, because a left-wing journal, the precursor to the Economic and Political Weekly, was critical of Nehru. During the emergency, of course, the war came home, so to speak, from the periphery to the center. So you saw the Central Reserve Force, the Central Reserve Police being deployed against protesters in Delhi and elsewhere. Even leading newspapers found themselves being treated the way only the left-wing press used to be. And I suppose I need hardly mention press censorship, intimidation and police violence in India today. Hundreds of districts in the country are under near paramilitary rule. Journalists are routinely confronted with legal threats. I could go on. But all in all, I think it's quite fair to suggest, as we do, that democratic and authoritarian rule in India have not been too different.
Thank you, both of you, for illustrating the point about the continuity. But now I would like to turn to the emergency period itself. And the first part of the book is basically an attempt to define what kind of regime the emergency was. And I'm not sure how many pages you spend on this problem, but many, which underscores the fact that it was a very complex phenomenon that can be defined from a variety of point of views. And you give at least 4 viewpoints or definitions of the emergency. One is the emergency as a constitutional dictatorship. A second element that you mention is the emergency as an ideology-less populist regime. A third one is the emergency as a corporatist regime. And finally, the emergency as a sultanist regime. So I would like to ask you to briefly explain to us what you mean by these 4 features of the emergency regime.
Well, I may do one and then, well, let's alternate, Pratinav, so we can cover the 4.
Okay.
The first, of course, very important thing to mention is that it's not a coup. It's a constitutional decision that is made by Mrs. Gandhi. Of course, under the influence of Sanjay, S.S. Ray, so many others. But she made this decision in reaction to the JP movement, in reaction to the Allahabad High Court decision in June 1975, and also in reaction to the defeat of Congress in Gujarat in the state elections. So it's not improvised. It was in the pipeline since January 1975, but it's certainly a constitutional, at least a constitution-based decision. She relies on an article of the Constitution that allows her to, in fact, concentrate power even more in her hands. But she was already, as I've said, a kind of empress in India. Why is it still constitutional? Well, primarily because institutions which are so important, parliament, the judiciary, remain in place. And this is completely surrealistic. You have parliamentary sessions that are going on in spite of dozens of MPs behind bars. And some parliamentarians, Madhu Limai, for instance, will invite his colleagues to resign from parliament, but they did not. So you have Jan Sangh MPs, socialist MPs, CPIM MPs sitting in parliament, arguing, giving the regime a facade of, you can say, credibility or respectability. So parliament is working. Laws are passed, bills are debated. In that sense, the constitution is going on. Similarly, the Supreme Court and the judiciary at large. No, judges sit, discuss, validate, sometimes upheld some decisions, but of course, they also gave the regime another facade of respectability. It's a judiciary that is bowing to the power that be. And in the habeas corpus case, for instance, really had a very dubious attitude regarding the right of individuals. Only one judge, Justice Khanna, was courageous enough for saying we should defend Indian citizens fully, even under the emergency. But the other judges did what Mrs. Gandhi was expecting. By the way, they also validate the withdrawal of any charge. You know, the charges that the Allahabad High Court had used against her, that went on appeal because of the Supreme Court. So we have a constitutional framework that, of course, was severely amended, but not completely transformed, because institutions of the Republic of India continue to work. And of course, the question that we may investigate further in our conversation is why? Why have judges showed so little courage? But that will be true of the media as well. But that's only the first part of my response. Sorry, Pratinav.
Right, so I guess I'll look at the other three: populism, corporatism, and sultanism. So now there can be no doubt that Mrs. Gandhi's regime was a populist one. So there was, for instance, a preference for acclamation over election, popular over procedural concerns, the national good over political pluralism. So what we see is that liberal precepts such as the rule of law and individual freedom took a backseat. What mattered to Delhi's rulers then were only the demotic aspects of democracy, that is, the will of the people and their socioeconomic well-being. So the upshot is a political style that was effective because she spoke to the people directly on radio and on the hustings, and schizophrenic because it appealed to people as diverse as communists and big business. But what her politics did not have was a well-defined program. So in place of a program, you had a personality, Mrs. Gandhi herself, and a clear set of enemies, the JP movement, the opposition parties, revolting peasants and trade unions, the press, and even the political institutions of the Republic, the judiciary, the opposition in parliament, the regulatory agencies, all of which needed to be undermined. But for all that, the lack of ideology and the like, there's nevertheless a core substratum of thinking that went into the regime. And this leads us to the third term, corporatism. Now, the foremost thinker of this ism is Philip Schmitter. For him, a corporatist society is basically a statist polity that prevents the free and pluralist representation of class interests. One where social rank and hierarchies are settled by the state, and everyone knows their station, which we think is an apposite description of the emergency regime. So a remark made by D.K. Barua, the Congress president during the emergency, quite aptly captures the kind of corporatist thinking that was common currency during the mid-70s. He said that trade unions were trying to mislead the working class and sabotage production. So every sectional interest that had a stake in political conflict then had to be disciplined. One of Mrs. Gandhi's favorite words, incidentally. Unions had to be disciplined, so did Parliament, the judiciary, the press. Apex bodies and advisory boards were set up to replace trade unionism. 60 MPs were locked up. Judges were transferred and threatened. Journalists were imprisoned. Censorship imposed. Now, when taken to extreme, corporatism can look a lot like what Weber called sultanism, the fourth attribute. So if corporatism is about top-down hierarchies, discipline, anti-pluralism, then sultanism is corporatism gone rogue. So here the leader becomes not merely the representative of the people, but as it were, the sultan. So more so than Indira Gandhi, it was her son, Sanjay, who represented the style of rule. So sultanism, as Juan Lenz has it, is a form of personal rulership based on loyalty to the ruler. Rulers exercise power without restraints and at discretion, and this is precisely what Sanjay did, surrounding himself by cronies, nepotistically using public monies to further his private enterprises, interfering with the Reserve Bank of India, Air India, Central Bank of India, the New Delhi Municipal Corporation, and shaping the Youth Congress in his image, making it a vehicle of his programs and his programs alone. So it could be said that the emergency rather conveniently married populism, corporatism, and sultanism, creating its own distinct brand of authoritarianism, which is precisely what the constitutional dictatorship was.
Thank you, both of you. I would like to jump in a way to the present day. And one of the striking things about the book is that if one forgets for a second the setting of the book, the 1970s, one might well think that he's reading a book about very contemporary India. From the anti-national rhetoric that Mrs. Gandhi used to define her opponents, to the personality cult, to attacks to university campuses and academic freedom, to the easiness that, Pratinav, you were mentioning, with which rulers manage to bend the rules or exercise arbitrary power and get away virtually with everything, in either maintaining their popularity, like Mrs. Gandhi largely did, or even increasing their popularity, like Narendra Modi is actually doing. So if the emergency was India's first dictatorship, as the title says, does it mean we are living through the second or going towards the second? Or more generally, what are similarities and differences between the two periods?
Well, I can again submit some of my ideas on this, and Pratinav will certainly be able to elaborate on or differ because that's not in the book. That's something we have not written together. Well, similarities are indeed very obvious from different points of view. But as you said, the most striking common feature is the personalization of power, you know, and that goes with populism. Both leaders are populist, but they go one step beyond each of them because there is a transition from populism to authoritarianism that is clearly at work in both contexts. You know, that is the common feature that for me reconfirms the huge heuristic power of Max Weber's notion of charisma. And in both cases, you see charisma at work. And I, of course, sometimes am objected to that, no, charisma is for Mahatma Gandhi only. No, charisma is not only for the good man. You know, Max Weber never said you're charismatic because you have virtues. No, you're charismatic because you're exceptional. What Max Weber says is the legitimacy of the strong man comes from the superhuman qualities that he can show by doing things nobody dared to do before. And Indira Gandhi did things nobody dared to do before. You know, you look at the 1971 war that broke Pakistan, you look at the annexation of Sikkim, you look at the first nuclear test in '74. No, the list of what she has done and that nobody else had done before is huge. And that's why she could be seen as Durga after the 1971 war. She becomes a form of superhuman leader. And she relates to the people, directly by using the radio, and that's something Narendra Modi does a lot with Man Ki Baat as well. But she has an amazing energy on stage. She is an event manager as well. She relates to the people the populist way. In the '71 election campaign, she took the country by storm. You know, I will not repeat all what I have just said. It works in the case of Narendra Modi almost symmetrically, you know. And the first point I made, the exceptional, completely unique decisions that he made. Something nobody dared to do before. Balakot strike. Nobody dared to do that before. Demonetization. Demonetization is seen as something, wow, he did it. Not seen as a policy, because the result of this charisma is what? You're above accountability. You are not responsible for what went wrong, never. You know, this is why Indira Gandhi could be re-elected in 1980, only 2 years after the emergency, or 3 years after the emergency. The people who had punished her in 77 in North India fully supported her during the time of election, because they did not consider that she was responsible for what had happened during the emergency. And Emma Tarlow's interviewees are repeating it ad nauseum. You know, she did not know. And we need a strong leader. So you have this clear ambivalence vis-a-vis what is democracy for Indians, vis-a-vis what is authority. But to respond to your question, yes, there are these similarities. And of course, it goes with the desinstitutionalization of party politics. The parties do not matter anymore. Congress on the one hand, BJP on the other hand. And of course, also you can say, weakening of all institutions, including the bureaucracy. Now, one big difference, and I'll stop. One big difference is Indira Gandhi had no plan. She had no ideology. She was really an opportunistic, pragmatic, power-angry woman. Power was what was driving her. She was the realpolitik person par excellence. And she had no organization. She tried to transform the Congress party into a cadre-based party that failed miserably. She had to fall back on the bureaucracy. On the other hand, Narendra Modi is the product of the RSS, as a huge organization at his disposal, and as an ideology and a plan, a long-term plan. He's not improvising anything. He's just implementing one by one all the points which were on the BJP's programs for decades. That makes a huge difference. And it makes the, you can say, it can make this trajectory somewhat irreversible. Whereas emergency could be reversed somewhat, not fully, but somewhat. And that's why I think we are not at all in the same I would say, context and circumstances.
Well, I must say I do agree with most of what Christophe said, in the sense that both of them were charismatic, transformative rulers. But I guess I will disagree on the final point that Modi is the more dangerous of the two, because I feel that the differences when it comes down to those, probably Indira Gandhi was the more transformative ruler. And this is because while the Sangh Parivar does possess a clear ideology, that is hardline views from everything from miscegenation to conversion, and a stronger base in RSS Shakas and BJP cadres, over 100 million now, I feel it has nevertheless been unable to turn these to full account. So there is undeniably less violence, state violence today than during the emergency. I think it is presentist to suggest otherwise. So while both Modi and Indira can be described as authoritarian populists, his political style is certainly less authoritarian, if only because he enjoys greater political legitimacy and has less need for authoritarian rule. The latitude for resistance is also greater today. Carceral figures, political violence, and the death toll is lower, though it may not seem so, but parliament and judiciary are more powerful today, the executive weaker. During the emergency, it must be remembered that there were 110,000 political prisoners, 60 MPs were in jail. Some 5,000 to 10,000 people died at the hands of the state, often trying to oppose its policies. Indira Gandhi also ran a very effective prior restraint regime, which has no equivalent today. There were no elections at the state and union level in 1975. Today, elections remain for the better part free and fair. So Modi, for all his strongman rhetoric, has never produced in legislative terms anything as far-reaching as the 42nd Amendment of 1976, under which fundamental rights were suspended when it came to challenging incarceration, emergency powers considerably expanded, parliament and judiciary crippled, the scope of president's rule in states of emergency widened, and the sanctions simplified. Indira Gandhi was also interested in moving towards presidentialism. Again, Modi appears utterly disinterested in such sweeping constitutional reform. All this is to say that there is far greater room for agency, greater resources for resistance today than at any point during the emergency regime. So on the whole, I think there is a certain defeatism in the comparison, which is why I'm somewhat averse to the common claim that we are living through, as it were, a second emergency. There may well be a second dictatorship in India, and we can speak about this at length, that democracy was never fully institutionalized in the country in the first place. Illiberal governance has more or less been the norm. But while acknowledging that there may be a second dictatorship at some point, I think it's also important to recognize that we aren't there yet.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, I would like now to pick up on one of the themes that you just brought up, which is what you call the shallowness of India's democracy. And this can be partly seen through the lenses of the resistance that the emergency had. And the third part of the book is dedicated to this, is the shorter part of the book, also because there wasn't much to say in a way. So there was resistance, but it was hardly consequential, and certainly was not the reason why democracy was restored in the end. So what does explain why Indians largely accepted the suppression of their democracy in the 1970s?
Well, you have to look at it in some perspective. The first very important thing to say is that Indira Gandhi had been in a position to transform the Congress into something completely different. And it is the condition of possibility for the emergency, the main condition of possibility. All the old-timers who had some local base were sidelined, replaced by yes men, sycophants. Chief ministers reported directly to her, and therefore federalism was largely circumvented. And that's the first explanation. It was possible because the party had been transformed, and the party was, of course, at that time very similar to the state. The other reason why that was possible was because she received support from a large array of milieux, and parties in the first place. The CPI supported it, the Shiv Sena supported it, the RPI supported it. So we have a coalition of parties that is very heterogeneous, showing that we are not at all in any ideological context, to repeat what we've said before. Secondly, besides this support coming from so many political parties, you have support coming from the business community. KK Birla, JRD, Tata were more than happy with the emergency as an era of discipline, when you can also make sure that strikes are illegal and would never take place again. And last but not least, we have the middle class that was tired of unrest, you have the 1974 railways strike, you had the JP movement disrupting this economy in Bihar and Gujarat, but not only. So the real question is, why have all these groups preferred to go for an authoritarian regime under the aegis of Mrs. Gandhi, rather than trying to manage the country the democratic way it was supposed to follow for decades? And that's where you test the credibility of democratic culture and democratic commitment. And I will not repeat all my list, but if you look at congressmen, none of them had the courage to object to Mrs. Gandhi that what she was doing was wrong. Jagjivan Ram was supposed to be the opponent within the party, but he never objected. In fact, he left at the very last moment in early 77 for creating the Congress for Democracy, but he had spent the full 21 months before in the government not objecting anything to Mrs. Gandhi. And that's something you may explain because of fear. Fear is a factor, and people close to Jagjivan Ram were indeed more than intimidated. They were tortured, and that's one factor. And Kuldeep Nayar, who was somewhat interviewing Jagjivan Ram, was told that his phone was tapped and that he could not speak his mind. So fear is certainly a variable that has to be factored in. But beyond this, you have two explanations. One, politicians were after power and were not prepared to take risk. Even Charan Singh could have turned his coat till the very last moment. We have so many indications of so many politicians who were more interested in a seat, in a kursi, than in the defense of democracy. And secondly and last, indeed, this is an acid test for the commitment to the values of democracy. Freedom, you can ask the question, who was prepared to die for freedom? And again, Kuldeep Nayar has a very interesting page in his book on the emergency, saying, I had expected demonstration the day after emergency was declared. Nobody was interested. Nobody was interested in democracy, freedom of speech, except few people who resisted, including Kuldeep Nayar and his newspaper, Indian Express, and the Statesman. Partly because the political culture had not been, if you want, institutionalized in the body politic. And that is largely due to this cult of personality. To pay allegiance to the leader prevailed, was more important than fighting for democracy and equality. And this is exactly what, by the way, Ambedkar says about the political culture of India. It says it's hero worship. And of course, he refers to Mahatma Gandhi's capacity to rule against majorities. Mahatma Gandhi never followed the majority rule, but that can apply subsequently to Indira Gandhi, to Narendra Modi today. This sense of a leader can decide, and we somewhat bow to his decisions as the legitimate decisions. In a way, it is an echo of the sense of authority within Indian society. And it's not only the hierarchy, the social hierarchies which are at work there, but also the Guru Shishya Parampara. This is the tradition of respect for the personality who knows better. And that goes against the democratic culture. So for all these reasons, we end up with a handful of resistance people. And those who resisted, by the way, did not necessarily resist because they wanted to defend democracy. There are very interesting letters that we cite by RSS cadres who said, we are resisting because we want the RSS to be legal again, because the ban against RSS was absolutely catastrophic for RSS leaders. We are not fighting for democracy primarily. We are fighting for our right to exist. So even among those who fought the emergency, you have motivations which are not necessarily pro-democracy. And that's why, and I end with that, that's why to study the emergency is a very interesting entry point into what is democracy in India. What is the political culture in India? So it's not only a 21-month story, it is an entry point into a much larger question that is very relevant today.
Well, Christophe has highlighted the widespread support of the regime, the power-hungry political elite, fear which motivated them, and the limits of the political culture. And to this, I might add just one more point, which is the very character of the emergency regime. So it was foremost an authoritarian regime, not a totalitarian one. That is, depoliticization was very much central to the logic of the emergency. So very few people were asked to rise in its defense by Delhi's rulers. And this is why I think very few people found cause to resist it either. So the upshot was passive acceptance, shrug of the shoulders. The whole point of the emergency then was to pacify, or as Indira Gandhi had it, discipline a deeply political society. So people needed to get off the streets. Judges needed to fall in line. Opposition parties needed to stop backing the JP movement. The working classes needed to be reminded of their station. They had to end their penchant for strikes. And all this required depoliticization. So it could be said then that the vision of the emergency was distinctly anti-political. So central to its logic was the pacification of universities, factories, the countryside. And Mrs. Gandhi was also aware that she would have been spectacularly inept at channeling, controlling, and mobilizing the masses. So it was that she never tried to push the emergency into a totalitarian direction. Weak authoritarianism was enough. So one doesn't see a Gandhi Uganda, this one word, a Hitler Uganda in Nazi Germany. Similarly, Sanjay Gandhi, despite Sanjay Gandhi's best efforts, that is, to make the Youth Congress into some kind of paramilitary arm of the Congress Party, it was nothing like, say, the Squadristi in fascist Italy. And even the slim volume Indira Gandhi published after the emergency, My Truth, or the 3 volumes of selected speeches and writings of Indira Gandhi, are nothing like Mao's Little Red Book. So the whole point of the emergency was to make people apathetic, uninterested in politics, inhere to the regime's programs, indifferent to resistance. And such views get right to the heart of the character of Indian democracy, as Christophe mentioned, and has dealt with at length in La Démocratie en Inde. So democracy on this account was a top-down imposition hammered out in camera by elite groupings, none of which were powerful enough to rule alone and unimpeded. So none of the 4 powerful classes that counted for anything were strong enough to rule alone. So they settled to rule collectively in a power-sharing arrangement. And democracy was precisely this kind of power-sharing arrangement between the ruling class of the Congress and the bureaucracy that came with it, the capitalist milieu, the dominant peasantry, and the remnants of the aristocracy. So when you have this entire force lined up behind you, it's very unlikely that you get a lot of resistance to it.
Thank you. So this would be my last question. So I would invite members of the audience to, if you have questions, to submit them through the chat, and then Ronojoy will curate them and ask them to the two authors. So my last question is, again, picking up something that Christophe mentioned at the beginning, which is a very interesting point, in my opinion, that one of the most profound legacies of the emergency was end of the JP movement that preceded it. It was the legitimization of the Hindu nationalist movement. And you quote Advani, who says that the JP movement removed the untouchability from the Hindutva project. So can you just tell us how did this happen?
Well, it started indeed with the JP movement, 73, 74. But of course, in a very specific context. You may remember that at that time, Vajpayee was the rising star of the Jan Sangh. And he wanted to make the party more acceptable to those who at that time were in favor of non-Congressism. So the opponents of Congress who were prepared to join hands against Congress, whatever their ideology, and that's the idea Loya had introduced in the 60s already, were also more than happy to bring Jan Sangh on board. So that's the context. In the JP movement, clearly they offered the cadre-based organizations JP needed. And at that time, Gamit Acharya was one of the ABVP leaders who in BR helped him a lot. Nanaji Deshmukh also was a very important RSS cadre who knew JP before because they had worked together in villages in the name of Gandhian reconstruction of rural India. So BR was the place where the ecosystem took shape. So JP said, I need them. I will use them. They are the most disciplined activists I can think of. And he legitimized them, you know, when he said, if you are a fascist, I am a fascist too. And that was a way to completely break with the leftist tradition of stigmatizing RSS as a fascist organization. That's something the Jan Sangh was very happy with, and they realized quickly that they could benefit from this by somewhat merging their identity in a larger opposition front. And that's something that will be precipitated during the emergency period in jail, because the big mistake Mrs. Gandhi made was to put all these political leaders in the same jails. So you add in TR jail, for instance, leaders who could prepare the ground for the Janata Party. And therefore, the Jan Sangh became not only useful as cadre-based organization fighting in the street or underground, but also a key component for the post-emergency elections which were to take place. And indeed, in 1977, Jan Sangh became the strongest party in many Indian states that were won by Janata Party, which resulted in the third phase, if you want. There is the JP movement, there is the emergency pressure cooker, if you want, in jail, and there is thirdly the Janata Party government, where they were indeed in a position, as Advani said, to be destigmatized. They were not the untouchables anymore because they were given very prestigious portfolios. Vajpayee became foreign minister. Advani became information and broadcasting minister. They were naturalized. Except that you still add socialists, including Madhulima and others, who criticized the dual membership situation in which ex-Jan Sangh ministers were. So they failed at the end, and the Janata Party broke. But a point of no return had been reached, and the way you can say Jansong or H Jansong is we are mainstreamized, could give birth, could explain afterwards, very soon afterwards, the making of BJP. And BJP was somewhat a post-Janata Party organization, at least in the beginning, using positive secularism and Gandhian socialism as its mottos. So yes, it's a turning point in that sense. You can say that there is a mainstreamization process that has been precipitated by the emergency, but we need to look at the phase before and the phase after for understanding the process fully.
Well, I suppose I have nothing to add to that. It was precisely the three things that Christophe mentioned that led to the mainstreamizing of the junta, the RSS. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank to both of you. That was my last question. This is what the book's like. It's published by Hearst & Co. And I will now leave the floor to Ronojoy, who will collate questions that came through the chat. Thank you both.
Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Christophe and Pratinav. So we have a few questions which I'll try and collate, which you also might be able to see probably on the chat function, since we don't have too much time, 20 minutes or so. So there's one question, I guess, what you present is a very bleak picture. So I think here's a question, not just of the emergency, but of Indian democracy in general. So there's a question about mobilization and responses, and this question is about the post-emergency period. What you see is in the late 80s, early 90s, in the formation of regional agrarian political parties, and of course you see the Mandal moment, the breakdown of the Congress system, the sort of third political system, if you will, and this is something, of course, that Christophe has written about in great detail. So the question is, after this regime, I guess, after the current regime, the Modi regime loses power, what will be the kinds of the basis of social mobilization, sort of looking into the future? And I'll just take the liberty of clubbing together a couple of other questions. One is, you talked about, Christophe talked about how the emergency was not, was unevenly felt across the country, and beyond the sort of Delhi and its sort of hinterland, not so much. So there's a question about how the Northeast experienced the emergency. I don't know whether if you have any views on that. There's also a question on the role of the army. What role did it sort of play? You talked about all the other institutions being subverted, etc. What was the impact on the army? So I think those are the few questions. There's one member of the audience, Vice Admiral Sinha, wants to make an intervention. So maybe I'll ask him to make his intervention, and if we can make it very brief. Admiral Sinha, do you want to make a quick intervention? Sorry, I don't see him anymore.
Yeah, one second. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please, if you can keep your intervention very short, thanks.
Video is also muted?
No, we can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, you don't need the video?
Not necessary,
okay,
but if you want to, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher. I think the overall analysis, after all, it's a lot of research work, and I know Christopher has been sort of, mastering the Indian political system for a long time. In fact, he knows more about politics than most of us put together. As far as just the last one that you mentioned, that the armed forces, well, armed forces have nothing to do with the politics of the country. They just follow what orders are given, and the generals have to discuss this with the politicians. Beyond that, it is really not the armed forces business, fairly apolitical. Now, what I want to put across is just that's only my thought process. Really, it's not a comment on your book or something. The political system in India was going through a churn. It is true that it was an elitist party, and Congress was the only party probably at the time of when the all the effort was being made to get the independence. I must tell you that one of the major reasons for people not being interested in getting the democracy back, I think both of you mentioned this, it is quite right. Because if you look at how many people actually sacrificed their life to get the independence.
Do you have a question for the author? If you can.
No, I don't have a question. I'm just giving a comment.
Okay.
And therefore, from being an elitist party, the political system in India was slowly shifting to become more democratic and not, being a family sort of tree. And that's exactly what the present system is doing, that getting that, the family business being in politics gradually out. It's not fully out. There are people who are even in the ruling party right now. But I think that, the track is right. It is just about 75 years. So I would think that possibly it takes that much of time for a country to stabilize as a full democracy. But I can tell you that it is more democratic than what you have made it sound. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sinha. Christophe and Pratinav, do you want to respond to the earlier questions that were posed?
Well, I may say a word about the army because it's a very good question, of course, especially if you look at India's neighbors. And never forget, by the way, that in 75, there is a coup in Bangladesh. And Mrs. Gandhi is very much afraid of a similar coup. That's something we have not mentioned so far. She was very insecure, and the root cause for emergency is also that she's on the defensive and she prefers to attack. She has been under attack. She's been vulnerable. She has been insecure for many years within the party in the first place, and beyond the party afterwards. But on the army, what is very interesting is, in fact, after the elections took place, Sanjay asked the Chief of Army Staff, T.N. Raina, to come and talk before the elections were officially released, or just after, I forget. But it's not yet clear whether Mrs. Gandhi and Sanjay will hand over power. They've lost, but Sanjay is at that time willing to try to do something with the army. And T.N. Raina is told that, in fact, 300 platoons, that means 25 infantry battalions, could do the job in the 300 districts of the country, one platoon per district. And that's something, of course, Mrs. Gandhi heard, even if she did not say anything. But the Chief of Army Staff, who had been appointed by her, of course, did not say much except, this is mathematically correct. That's all. It's a very interesting episode because you see the army as uncommitted, not prepared to support a dictator. That was before politicization of the army. And the big difference between the emergency and the present dispensation is that Mrs. Gandhi had no time to colonize the state institutions. It was too quick. And it makes a big difference when you take the time to be very sophisticated, to appoint your people in the different institutions which matter: the judiciary, the bureaucracy, the army, the IB, the intelligence services. So I just wanted to say this, and I hand it over to Pratinav for other questions.
Oh yeah, right. About the point about the army, and that's the 1977 episode was quite something, and I think it's a testament incidentally to the healthy civil-military relations that Indira Gandhi's father, Nehru, had fostered, that India did not see its second dictatorship in 1977. So the coup ended up not very different from Trump's coup last month. It was too little and too late. But more than the army, I think we also need to talk about the paramilitaries. And they're also a million-strong force in India in 1975, and they were quite ready to work and be deployed by Indira Gandhi on the streets of Delhi and elsewhere. So you often have demolition squads coming in with strong paramilitary backing to do the task at hand. And so while the army itself had nothing to do with the emergency, India's paramilitary forces certainly did, and they did play a strong role in seeing that there was little dissent that was expressed violently. And about the point about the Northeast, we do have a bit about the Northeast, in fact. And what we noticed was that the emergency didn't really have much traction there. And Mrs. Gandhi took credit for pacifying the Northeast, as she put it, by signing deals with the Naga and Mizo rebels in November 1975 and July 1976, respectively. So before that, some Nagas and Mizos were taken prisoner during the emergency. But after these accords were signed, one basically saw that there was no emergency as such in the Northeast. They chalked far fewer sterilizations, demolitions, and the like. And the final point about the kinds of future mobilization, I think the last 2 years have shown that they're not going to be too different from the kinds of mobilizations we've seen in the past. The last round of peasant protests, the still ongoing ones, are no different from the ones we saw in the 80s or 1979, for that matter, or the urban protests of last year against the CAA movement, which was, I mean, of course, those protests had a lot in common with the JP movement or Anna Hazare's protests of 2011. So I feel you will see mass mobilization increasingly on the streets, and I don't think it's going to be any different from the past.
Christophe, did you have anything to add on the mobilization bit, or?
Well, I can't say a word, not looking at the present mobilization, but at the mobilizations which followed the Janata Party phase, because that's what the participant was asking, I think, also. You know, it's interesting to see that the caste politics that developed in the 80s, 90s, 2000s were neither something the Congress wanted, nor something the BJP wanted. So when we have some democratization process, they are not born within the two mainstream parties. They come from elsewhere. They come from some periphery of the political system. So caste politics was born with the Jan Morcha of VP Singh, and then the Samajwadi Party of Mulayam Singh Yadav, and of course BSP that was created by Kanshiram in the first place. And this is an interesting point to make. Dominant parties usually try to resist mobilizations by plebeians, trying to democratize India's democracy. And today what we see, to my mind, is precisely that. We've had a real upsurge, you know, what I've called a silent revolution. We've seen for 3 decades, at least the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, well, at least the beginning, we've seen the rise of plebeians, OBCs, Yadavs in particular, Dalits, Jatavs in particular, in the north of India. And the Hindutva mobilization is a counter-mobilization for me, and it's a counter-revolution. The idea being to make sure that caste politics is dislodged by, you can say, identity politics, Hindu majoritarianism. Forget about your caste, think that you're Hindu first. So the history of India's democracy can certainly be seen also from that point of view. We have an alternation of mobilizations that emerge at the periphery of the political system, and a capacity of the mainstream parties, or at least dominant parties, to counter that, which means that there is no linear democratization process at work. It's a stop and go. And this stop and go process, these ups and downs, go also parallel with centralization, decentralization. When you have a reaction against the plebeian.
Sorry,
no problem. When you have this kind of reaction, it goes with more authority, more centralization. It's always at the expense of federalism. When on the contrary, you have the rise of, I would say, peripheries, social peripheries. It's also the rise of, I would say, geographical peripheries. And you see the third force, you see the UPA 1, UPA 2, which are not only more democratic in the sense that they are more social, and never forget that Mandal 2 was under UPA 2. And never forget that the democratization process that has been initiated by non-Congress people had finally been implemented by Arjun Singh and other Congress people. Not only there is this social dimension, but there is the federal, I would say, decentralization dimension. So we may certainly look at the trajectory of democracy in India as a cyclical kind of trajectory, with an alternation in power of strong men or strong women representing elite groups and centralizing power in their hands and in Delhi. And on the contrary, phases of democratization, social democratization, that go with more decentralization and more federalism. Now, the question really is, will we see a phase of that kind in the future, or is majoritarianism the only game in town? And that's quite possible. You know, other countries have stopped their cycles because they have killed the alternatives. And the question is, what will be the alternative to BJP in the future, if any? That's of course an open question.
Right. I think we've run out of time unless Diego has any pressing questions. If not, I think that was an extremely interesting and fascinating discussion, both I think on the emergency itself, but also sort of looking at parallels with the current situation and also looking ahead. So I shall repeat what Diego had done. Here is a copy of the book. I think both of us thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. It was incisive and analytical, but also, as Diego said, extremely readable. So I think it has all the qualities that one can sort of recommend of a book. And those of you who don't have a copy, please go ahead and get one. And on that note, thank you once again, Christophe and Pratinav, for making the time to join us in a discussion, and hope to involve in future such talks and roundtables. With that, and thanks to the audience too for patiently listening in. Thanks.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.